Good evening, everyone. I would like to invite you to grab a seat. Our program will be starting right now. So, good evening, and thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Rick Lee. I'm the Associate Director of the Tyler Clementi Center. And on behalf of our director, Dr. Sue Furr, I'd like to welcome you to our first event for this spring semester, Moment of Movement, Activism, and Social Justice in the Digital Age. Before I turn over the proceedings to my colleague, Professor Sylvia Chan-Malik, I just want to share with you our mission of the Tyler Clementi Center and also thank our sponsors, which is always a wonderfully gratifying job. So the Tyler Clementi Center was established 2 years ago and is a collaboration between Rutgers University and the Tyler Clementi Foundation. Our mission is to create and share knowledge about young people making the transition to college and coming of age in the digital era. I would invite all of you to learn more about our center on our website, clementicenter.rutgers.edu. And I also would like to invite you to mark your calendars for 2 upcoming events later this semester, and I hope that you will join us. On Thursday, April 2nd at 4:30 p.m. at the Alexander Library on the College Avenue campus, we will have a panel discussion on the history of gender-neutral housing and safe spaces at Rutgers and on other college campuses. Yes, exactly. That's Thursday, April the 2nd at 4:30, and Lauren will be there. And Monday, April the 6th at 8 p.m. On the College Avenue Student Center, we'll have a panel discussion on microaggressions featuring a lecture by Professor Kevin Nadel, who's the Executive Director of CLAGS, the Center for LGBTQ Studies out of CUNY. After his talk, we'll have a panel discussion focusing on the Language Matters campaign that was launched this year by our very own 4 cultural centers here at Rutgers. So again, April the 2nd and April the 6th, so mark your calendars, please. I would like to acknowledge 2 individuals who've been instrumental in developing tonight's program. So late last fall, Sylvia Chan-Malik from the Department of American Studies and the Department of Women's and Gender Studies, and Daniel Hodnott from the Asian Student Council both separately invited the Tyler Clementi Center to collaborate with them on a spring program. Once I learned that both of them had similar ideas about designing a program on race, gender, digital media, and social justice, I invited them to think about joining forces, and here we are tonight. In addition to Sylvia and Daniel, I would also like to thank our other sponsors, the Office of the Executive Vice President for Academic Affairs, the Department of American Studies, and the minor in Comparative and Critical Race and Ethnic Studies, the Asian Student Council, the Department of Women's and Gender Studies, the Asian American Cultural Center, the Center for Social Justice Education and LGBT Communities, the Collective for Asian American Studies, the Queer Caucus, and finally, I want to make a note and thank that the food has been funded by RUSA allocations and student fees. So thank you all. The Rutgers University Bookstore has kindly helped us to sell some of Professor Chang's books. So Can't Stop, Won't Stop, A History of the Hip Hop Generation, as well as Hot Off the Press, Who We Be, The Colorization of America, are both available for purchase in the back, and you will all are eligible for a 10% discount. All right, so that's just in the back. One final housekeeping note, those of you who have passports for the transfer program, Lizzie is there to sign your passports after the conclusion of the program. I would now like to introduce our moderator, Sylvia Chan-Malik, who will share a few words about the format of tonight's program and introduce our esteemed panel of speakers later on. Professor Chan-Malik teaches in the Departments of American Studies and Women's and Gender Studies. Her research examines the intersections of race, religion, gender, and sexuality through critical frameworks of American transnationalism and comparative ethnic studies, with a specific focus on the history of Islam in the United States. Her forthcoming book manuscript is entitled A Part of Islam, U.S. Muslim Women and the Question of Race. Please join me in welcoming Sylvia to the stage.
Good evening, and thank you so much for coming. It's so exciting to see this event come to fruition and to have such a wonderful turnout on the Monday, the week before spring break. I thank you all so much. At least the weather is nice, so we're done with the snow. We're really done. So it is my honor and privilege tonight to introduce Jeff Chang. And let me just read you his very, impressive CV first before I make a few additional remarks. Jeff Chang is the executive director of the Institute for Diversity in the Arts at Stanford University. A radical historian with both street cred and academic chops, Chang talks about multiculturalism, race relations, student activism, political engagement, the state of the arts, and the politics of abandonment. His first book, Can't Stop, Won't Stop, his award-winning first book, I should say, Can't Stop, Won't Stop, A History of the Hip-Hop Generation, won the American Book Award, and is only ostensibly about hip-hop. It's really a cultural history. His new book is entitled Who We Be, The Colorization of America, and examines the cultural transformation of the U.S. over the last 3 decades. And I will have to mention some of my students are here, and it's been an absolute joy to teach wonderfully accessible history. And we talked about in my class how they generally stop teaching you U.S. history like right after the Civil Rights Movement. So, for all of you educators out there, Jeff's book is a wonderful kind of, history that takes it up right there. Chang was named by the Utne Reader as one of the 50 visionaries who are changing your world and has been a USA Ford Fellow in Literature. He was also a founding editor of Color Lines magazine and a senior editor-director at Russell Simmons' 360hiphop.com. Chang also co-founded and ran the influential hip-hop indie label Soul Sides, now called Quantum Projects, helping to launch the career of DJ Shadow, among others. So Jeff Chang grew up in Honolulu and received a master's in Asian American Studies from UCLA and was an organizer for the National Hip Hop Political Convention. Chang was the editor of Total Chaos, an anthology examining the influence of hip hop culture into other art forms, and he's currently working on 3 book projects, Who We Be Youth, 2 book projects now, Who We Be's done, that's your bio. Youth, and a biography of Bruce Lee. He has written for The Nation, The New York Times, Foreign Policy, Vibe, and the LA Review of Books. So, I am incredibly thrilled to have Jeff here today, not just because of this amazing list of accomplishments and his amazing publications, but for this very public opportunity for me to express to him my admiration and gratitude on a public stage for the ways his intelligence, insight, and profound generosity have had a transformative impact on me, on my work as a writer, a teacher, and a scholar. So my students, Back in the day, before my academic life, I joined the staff of a very sadly now defunct independent weekly in the San Francisco Bay Area called the San Francisco Bay Guardian, where Jeff was, at the time, the hip-hop writer. Along with others, he was one of many amazing writers there, but everybody knew Jeff Chang. And he had this amazing street cred because he had run this record label. He knew everybody. Everybody knew Jeff. Everybody read Jeff. They would be like, oh, did you read, Jeff Chang's new piece? It was kind of like that. He was writing in a moment in the 1990s when young folks on the left still looked to hip hop and rap as a voice of social consciousness, especially for people of color. In the Bay Area in the mid-1990s, the sounds of hip hop and rap came through the conduit of the area's multiculturalism, the Mexican corridos of International Boulevard, the jazz of the Fillmore, Filipino DJs in Vallejo and Union City, and the hustle and bustle of Chinatown and Japantown. To put it another way, it was a time when we were talking about hip hop, about music, about culture, but we were also really, really, really talking about race, how to make, build, and coalesce around a language of struggle and protest, of anti-racism, and of social justice, just like I think we're doing now. It was also a time in the aftermath of the Los Angeles uprisings of 1992 for young Asian Americans like Jeff and myself to think long and hard about issues of anti-Black racism and coalitional activism. And especially, I think, for us working as Asian Americans in close proximity to Black communities and Black culture, we had to think about and struggle about how to advocate for and support Asian American struggles while also working with groups on anti-racist and progressive issues in a larger way. So I know that Jeff, like myself, continues and has never stopped thinking about these issues, and I hope we can talk much more later about how he's thinking about it today. I want to end with a very personal note. I want to thank Jeff, and he maybe doesn't even remember this, for an email he sent to me back in 2000, not long after yeah, that's a long time ago, huh? Gosh, I was like 12, you know? I was like, yeah. Not long after I joined The Guardian, regarding a piece about Asian imagery in hip hop. It was really an attempt for me to think about race as a young writer, about how to understand the circulation of race in hip hop. And I had gotten some criticism and pushback from the piece from well-known activists in the community about what people saw as my fundamental misunderstandings about race at the time. And I'll just be very honest, I was sad and young and crushed, you know, that people didn't like me. And I didn't think I don't think we had formally met at the time, but like I said, everybody knew, you know, Jeff Chang, and that he was, you know, this really amazing writer and activist, and I had read him and admired him for years. And then suddenly in my inbox one day, I got an email from Jeff. And I was like, whoa, Jeff Chang, that's really cool. And he did this in this incredibly gracious sort of, I think only Hawaiians can do this. Jeff is from Hawaii originally. It's like this kind of thing, this very gracious thing that Jeff just wrote me saying, you know, good job. You know, complimented me and saying he appreciated it and thought the piece was important. And though he may not have known it, that meant the world at the moment. And gave me the permission and the resolve to keep trying to figure out this conversation about race that I hope we can have more of tonight, that I was trying to have at that time, and one in which I'm still trying to figure out to this day. So I want to thank Jeff so much for my own personal journey, and I'm so proud and honored and happy that I got him to come out to Rutgers. And Jeff, take it away.
Thank you, Sylvia. You didn't tell me you were going to make me cry and shit. It's really moving because in a lot of ways, you know, Sylvia really captured a time where we felt like we were kind of, you know, sort of Tupac, right? Like us against the world in a lot of ways. And I gained as much from knowing Sylvia as Sylvia may have gained from me. It was a type of situation where Sylvia's voice at that particular time, and still to this day, has been one that's been clear, one that's been true, one that has been very, very committed to expressing a strong feminist point of view, a sort of bridging religious gaps, bridging racial gaps, and trying to lead us towards where we need to be going. And so I'm really inspired and so thankful that I get to be here and say that to you too publicly. Thank you. I also want to thank the Clementi Center, to Dr. Furr, to Rick Lee, to Daniel for pulling this together, to all of the people who came together, to Mark with the tech back there, to all the folks who came together to pull this event together today. It's an incredible honor for me to be as well on this panel with all of these amazing people, and I can't wait for the discussion to happen. And thanks to all of you for coming out. I know if it was this cold, I'm from California, and before that I'm from Hawaii, I wouldn't have come out, so. so I respect that. Thank you very much for that. I want to start here today, because this past weekend, President Obama commemorated the 50th anniversary of the uprising in Selma. And it was an uprising that was sparked by a state trooper's killing, right, of a young black deacon and a voting rights activist named Jimmy Lee Jackson, who was protecting his mother and his grandfather from being beaten by the police. And so Jackson was shot at close range after a police riot erupted during a voting rights protest, right? And after he was shot at close range into his abdomen, he went outside, he was trying to escape, and they beat him some more. And he eventually died because of his injuries. And President Obama didn't mention this incident, actually, in the fantastic speech that he gave, otherwise fantastic speech that he gave this past weekend. But he did speak of Selma as a battleground in the war for freedom, akin to the Gettysburg, the battle for Gettysburg. He said, it was not a clash of armies in Selma, but a clash of wills, a contest to determine the meaning of America. And let's note here that there hasn't been a national consensus for racial justice in 50 years. What we've seen during the last half century has been a steady rollback of the victories of the civil rights movement. And so the march from Selma to Montgomery eventually resulted in the passage of the Voting Rights Act. And this is the very same act that today right-wingers have been trying to, and in many ways succeeded, in rolling back in order to disenfranchise the emerging new cultural majority that appeared at the polls in 2008 and 2012 to elect Barack Obama. Let me give you one more year here. We can tie all these years together. So we have 1965, we have 2008, we have 2012, we have 2042, right? 2042 has become sort of a demographic Y2K, right? It's the year that it all falls apart, right? According to some people. It's the year that the U.S. is projected to become a majority minority. But what does it mean, anyway, to be majority minority? Because if we're all minorities, we still have to figure out how we're going to become a majority together. So the far right has a vision around this, right? They believe in continuing minority rule, the rule of the 1%, right? And this is why they've been playing havoc with the Voter Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act. So however you feel about Obama as a president, he got a lot of things right in his talk this weekend. He got that one major thing wrong, but he got a lot of things right. He said the victory at Selma was, a quote, a victory for the idea of a just America, a fair America, an inclusive America, and a generous America. And so what I'm saying here tonight is that we are engaged, whether we like it or not, in another kind of war. And I don't use these militaristic metaphors lightly at all. But I want to argue that we're in a war over culture, and that this war is very, very high stakes. And it's this way that I want to frame our discussion tonight as we think about movements versus moments and what this means in this digital age. So in order to start, we have to look at this context of what's happening right now. And to look again, we start here, the symbolism of Obama. It's as good a place to start as any, right? Obama in 2007 presented himself literally as a black and white man who himself, in his body, would reconcile the nation, right? His famous words about there being not a red America, a blue America, a United States of America, right? And so as his campaign picked up steam, he was colorized, literally, black and white man, colorized as an image of hope. I mean, here's where you start hearing that useless word, post-racial, right? It's like a joke now, right? Remember when we were all post-racial? Oh, it seems so long ago. But he goes from being, again, a black and white man to a man colorized as a symbol of hope, a man who symbolizes reconciliation, and from that to a symbol of all things other. So Obama's not just black, he's not just the product of miscegenation, he's also suddenly a Muslim, right? He's a socialist, he's a quote-unquote illegal alien, and suddenly the culture wars are back in full swing. So this is a period in which we've seen a return to the culture wars, right? This is a period that in the 90s, again, this is what made us feel sort of like it was us against the world all the time. And they're sparked by what my colleague at Stanford, Professor Samuel Leem, calls demographobia. He calls it kind of half-jokingly demographobia, the irrational fear of changing demographics. And it takes a particular kind of form, right? There's a belief in an ideal of a homogeneous nation, and attached to that is this quaking fear of a culture conditioned by change, right? And like all wars, the culture wars were not inevitable. But what we see is, first in the 80s and then going through the 90s, and again in the late 2000s, is the culture wars erupt because demographic change and multiculturalism and cultural change have prompted new discussions about democracy, particularly around contested values of empathy, of inclusion, of recognition, and change, right? And so after Obama's election, these wars, they flare anew, and it's now framed as a struggle, literally, for the soul of America, a clash of competing narratives, the story of a great America that we're in danger of losing forever, versus the story of a hopeful emerging America, the end of American civilization versus the beginning of a great national transformation. And both sides understand that the battles over culture are very high stakes. The battle between restoration and transformation, right? Between retrenchment and change begins in the culture. Cultures where change can be thwarted or where it might flower. And so what's been the result of these culture wars? Where there was a poll that just came out. It was taken last month. It was just released this past weekend that showed that 4 in 10 Americans believe that this period, right, which was supposed to be one of reconciliation, has become a period in which 4 in 10 Americans believe that race relations have actually gotten worse. And this despite, again, our hopes in 2007 and 2008. And here's the other result, right? The economic result of the past, especially 3 decades, where the politics of racial division have prevailed. It's become the worst income inequality that we've seen in generations and generations. Now, many people argue that class is the real issue, right? That it's not about race, it's not about gender, it's not about sexuality, but in the culture wars, it's been about all of the above. Why were working class and middle class Americans turning so strongly against their class interests, their clear class interests, after supporting for half a century strong government, economic reform, social programs? Why were they doing that? It was the culture wars. Because through these politics of racial division, fears are continually being stoked. The culture wars are kind of like a shock doctrine, right? If you don't vote for us, then they're going to overrun your America, right? And so America's very real fear over the future is conflated with the fear of the other. And in the end, only the elites win. Everyone else is lost. So income inequality between whites and people of color has barely changed since the height of the war on poverty. People of color still earn as little as half of every dollar made by whites. And if you look at wealth inequality, Black and Latino household median net worth is still less than 5 and 7% of white household median net worth. And what's worse is, after a peak of desegregation 25 years ago in 1989, we've been seeing rising rates of resegregation in our schools and neighborhoods. In 2010, 80% of Latino and 74% of Black K-12 students attended majority non-white schools. But whites remain the most segregated of all. The average white student attended a school that was 75% white. And I want to make one more point here around demographics. As we mentioned earlier, the US is going to turn majority minority by 2042. Americans under the age of 18 will become a majority non-white, majority minority by 2023. And so what we have here is a graph, and what you see here is a bunch of different states, right? And the red graph is percentage of whites over the age of 65 in these states. The blue graph is the percentage of whites under the age of 18 in these same states. And I can go ahead and read this to you. It's Arizona. These states are Arizona, Nevada, California, Texas, New Mexico, and Florida. These are the states that have the largest what they call the cultural generation gap. And these are the states where the culture wars have been flaring anew. If you want to look at the map in a different kind of way, the states that are darker have this large cultural generation gaps. And again, if you want to look at the last election, right, battleground states that we might not have expected before, North Carolina, Colorado, Georgia. Now, the tragedy is, right, the politics of generational division here are producing a situation that might be untenable for older folks in the future, because they're going to be depending upon you all for their pensions, for their Social Security, for their Medicare. And so if your generation comes up undereducated, resegregated, underemployed, that's going to be a disaster for everyone. And so this brings us to what may be really the most important question of your time, right behind the question of what we're going to be doing with the environmental crisis, with climate change. And the question is, if we're all minorities, how do we begin to imagine a new majority? And it has to start in the culture. We can't get to an agenda for racial justice without a culture for racial justice. Now, no one says this is going to be easy. Polls show that right now, more Americans believe more than at any time since 1992 that race is among the most important issues facing the nation. The last time there was a peak before that was 1965, right? But polls also consistently show a gap between the races and how they perceive the moment that we're in. So in the wake of Ferguson, blacks overwhelmingly felt that this is the perfect time for us to be able to have these conversations about race that we have not had for a very long time. But there was still a strong plurality of whites, not a majority, but a plurality who feel that the media at this particular moment is paying too much attention to issues on race. So we're very far from attaining some sort of a consensus on racial justice. We don't all agree that there's a problem to be solved if you're trusting the polls. And we're going to talk again a little bit more, I think, during our panel about how these things can change. But right now, we're living in a very difficult moment for the social imagination. This is a time in which we're told our dreams are over. Or it's an era, if you want to put it another way, in which all of our dreams are being dreamed for us and then sold back to us. Right? This is the Super Bowl ad from last year. Or it's an era in which it feels impossible to even imagine how our politics could even be fixed, in which there seems to be some confusion about what change actually seems to mean and how it can be achieved. But how do we move, right, from this to this to this, right? Protests happened across the country almost every single day from August 9th, the day that Michael Brown was left in the streets in Ferguson. Every single day there was a protest from August 9th all the way through November 24th, and since then, almost every day since, right? They disrupted the biggest shopping weekend of the year. They interrupted sporting contests. They emptied college campuses and walkouts. All the while, they were calling attention to police brutality, to racial inequality, to resegregation. And this is, of course, a picture of the black congressional staffers and some congresspeople in the shadow of the American Capitol, a project that's still quite clearly under construction and reconstruction. Now, there are elders, right, like David Garrow, the King biographer and a veteran of the civil rights movement, who criticized young protesters as irrational because they, quote, don't seem to offer a rational analysis on how does A and B, that is protest A or protest B, advance your policy change X and Y. Now, aside from the fact that protesters have been very clear about what their demands are, it's all up on the internet. You can go and check it out, Mr. Garrow. But they also recognize that the nature of the state is very different than it was in the 1960s. It's no longer a state that's reactive to protests like it might have been in 1965. It's a reactionary state, to use Vijay Prashad's coining. It's impossible to imagine right now a bill that we could float in Congress that might end the criminalization of young people, or a bill that might re-desegregate schools and housing at this particular moment. So what it takes to change the world in 2015 looks very different from what it took to change the world in 1965. But I'd argue that protests are not irrational. They're regenerative. They regenerate the imagination for change through cultural interventions that point towards a new politics. And that's part of the work right now, right? In order to generate movements, we need to be able to spark the imagination. These are times that have been defined by phrases, by hashtags, right? Hands up, don't shoot, Black Lives Matter. And the reality is that these hashtags have not been the ends of the movement. They've been the means to create a new movement. And yet, we still have a lot of people who criticize this, right? They call it hashtag activism, they call it clicktivism, they call it slacktivism. But those who try to criticize this and contrast physical organizing with other kinds of organizing, social media organizing, are missing the point. The two aren't incompatible, they're absolutely complementary. And for those of us who are really concerned with change, we recognize that this is just another tool in our toolkit. And so it just reinforces how critics of activism and organizing in general don't understand what change is or how it happens. And so I want to spend a little bit of time on this particular slide here. It's an abstract kind of slide. I want you to stay with me, right? This is a wave, all right? It's a powerful metaphor for change. And whenever I flash this at Stanford, all my students go, oh, great, he's going to talk about the wave. But just humor me for a second, okay? People have tended to speak of change in terms of a wave, right? So elections come along, and they become wave elections. In 2008, Barack Obama gets elected. It's a wave election. 2010, the Tea Party comes into an office. It's a wave election, right? 2012, Barack Obama gets reelected. It's a wave election. 2014, the Republicans take over Congress. It's a wave election. So it's a powerful metaphor, right? But what are we really talking about if we're talking about a wave? Now, on the one hand, a wave is an event. It's a body of water that we can see breaking over this reef. This is on the south shore of Tahiti. But in scientific and lexical terms, a wave is a paradox. It's a thing, it's an event. We can see this wave of water breaking on the reef, for instance, but it's also a motion. It's a process. The way that we think about change is in terms of events, right? We think of change as an election happening or a judicial decision or a protest, right? But a wave is not just an event, it's also a process. It's the process of these forces that are generated in the Antarctic that roll up from the bottom of the ocean and overhead in the atmosphere. All of these invisible forces that gather, that roll across hundreds of miles of open ocean until, boom, they hit this reef on the south shore of Tahiti. Then you have the famous Teahupo'o wave. So wave's an event, but it's also a process generated by all kinds of invisible forces. What if we thought of change not only in terms of events, but in terms of the process, right? A process that, like the ocean itself, really never stops moving, right? So we can think of culture as the ocean. Culture is the realm of ideas. It's the realm of images. It's the realm of stories. It's the narrative that we're all immersed in every day. It's where we find community. It's where we form identity. It's where we forge the collective will to change, right? It's where we express our deepest values. Politics is where some of the people are some of the time. Culture is where most of the people are most of the time. And I say all that to say this, that cultural change always precedes political change. Put another way, that political change is the last manifestation of cultural shifts that have already occurred. And that's not to say that there's a one-to-one kind of mystical relationship that if I go ahead and tweet today that police brutality will end, that it will end suddenly tomorrow. It's not like that at all. But it's to say that even in these times when we can't imagine how change could occur, we have to be about the work of keeping that imagination alive. And that's why we work in the culture. Now, a year before he was assassinated, Martin Luther King Jr. gave a speech at Riverside Church in Harlem, and he said some controversial things there. He called America, quote, the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. And he called for Americans to take a stand against the war. And because of this, the Beyond Vietnam speech, unlike the March on Washington speech, became his most criticized and reviled speech ever. But at that moment in history, 40 years ago, we stepped away from a lesson that could have made these past decades look a lot different. Since 1965 and the Selma Spring, King had argued that racism, militarism, and poverty were the triple scourges of America and the world. And so the struggle to end segregation, the struggle to end the war, the struggle to end poverty, they were all part of the same struggle. And he said, our only hope today lies in our ability to recapture the revolutionary spirit and go out into a sometimes hostile world, declaring eternal hostility to poverty, racism, and militarism. In this speech, King argued that values work was central to change. If the U.S. was going to get on the right side of history, he said, the nation must undergo a radical revolution of values. He added, a true revolution of values will soon cause us to question the fairness and justice of many of our past and present policies. King had become increasingly convinced in 1965, all the way through his death, that a reform agenda of pushing for changes in policy was not going to was not going to be enough to take us all of the way that we needed to get to. Policy reform was only part of the larger revolution of values that was needed. So we had to change the culture. Through the culture, we could express values that would lead us away from segregation and towards inclusion, away from fear and towards creativity, away from wounds and towards healing. And so that's why, and I want to end here, I'm especially interested these days in the young activists and artists who speak in the language of dreams. Groups like the Dream Activists, the Dreamers, right? And the Dream Defenders. They argue that we all need to be able to dream together again, all of us together, to build not just a movement, but a movement of movements that will take us to another world. Now, every generation, and that includes our generation, right? Mine and Dr. Chan Malik's generation, we leave to the next generation the problems that we couldn't resolve. And so this is what is left to you. It's left to you to reconstruct our divided polity. It's up to you to help us to develop new visions that will bring an end to segregation, an end to the culture wars. To replace it with a culture that fosters racial justice and helps us to bring about a real reconciliation. And when 2042 comes, y'all are going to be my age. That's pretty old. And as a generation, you'll be nearing the peak of your powers. And so if you can do something for me, right, and for my kids, I have a son who just started this year as a freshman in college. And their kids, it'd be for you all to start thinking and acting on these questions now. Don't wait for 2042. Start now. And a new consensus for racial justice has to also be intergenerational. So I want each of us, even if you're not in your 20s, if you're already on your way there, past your 20s to the other side, I want each of us to consider, right, how these important questions can be answered in each of our daily lives to form a stronger democracy with freedom and justice for all. Let's not wait another 50 years to build this consensus for racial justice. Let's do it now. Thank you very much.
Yeah, come on up. So thank you so much to Professor Chang for that wonderful talk. It gives us a lot to talk about. I failed to mention a little bit earlier the format that our panel is going to take. So right now we have an amazing panel of thinkers, scholars, activists, and I want to just briefly introduce everyone. And then I wanted to say, so I'm going to introduce the panel, and then we are going to have a conversation about, you know, this kind of idea of what are we going to do, and what do we use digital media for, in thinking about this future we hope to create. And at the end, for about the last 20 minutes or so, we would like to open it up to the audience, and we have 2 microphones set up on each side of the room, and we would ask that if you would like to ask a question, please line up at the microphones. We are live streaming, and so we need you to speak into the mic so we can pick it up on the stream. So let me just introduce our amazing panel right now. I'm just going to read, let me see, I'm going to go down the line, so I'm going to read here. So right next to Professor Chang, we have Professor Brittany Cooper, my brilliant, beautiful, and fearless colleague in Women and Gender Studies. Dr. Cooper is Assistant Professor of Women and Gender Studies and Africana Studies at Rutgers University. She is completing her first book project, very close, Race, Women, Gender in the Making of a Black Public Intellectual Tradition, 1892 to the present. Her study interrogates the manner in which public Black women have theorized racial identity and gender politics and the methods they use to operationalize those theories for the uplift of Black communities. She is also the co-founder, along with Susanna Morris, of the Crunk Feminist Collective, a feminist of color scholar activist group that runs a highly successful blog. Was it 1.7 million or what? Clicks or views every month? And she is also a regular contributor on Salon.com, and she's just won so many awards. And she was one of the Roots most 100 people to watch in 2014. So watch her. Next to Dr. Cooper, we have also the amazing Donna Austin, amazing PhD candidate here at Rutgers University. Donna is completing her dissertation. Oh, this is an old, you've shifted it now. Well, but she's looking at issues of race and gender and identity amongst Muslims in the U.S. Previously, she had been looking in the San Francisco Bay Area, now looking more in New Jersey and the New Jersey, Philadelphia, New York area. In addition to her academic work, she's been an activist and organizer for the American Muslim community for nearly 15 years. She's published articles, on African American and Latino Muslims, including her most recent book chapter, Color Me Invisible, The Hidden Legacy of African American Muslims, which appears in The Black Experience in America, edited by Gail Tate and Edward Rumsen. Okay, so now next to, Vanessa, sorry, I'm so looking, okay. Vanessa, okay. Next to Donna, we have Vanessa Tech, and so I wanted to, so happy to have this amazing group of young activists here on the end. Vanessa Tech, a daughter of Cambodian American refugees, is committed to creating more inclusive campus climates and rooting social justice in love and counter storytelling. She co-founded Project Ava, a social justice multimedia storytelling company, which I looked at the website today, it's beautiful, and currently serves as its EVP of Multimedia and Outreach, a former co-chair for the Coalition of API Americans collaborating together to unite the Southwest, or the acronym is CACTUS, very clever. She is currently pursuing a master's degree in higher education at the University of Denver with a focus on facilitating retention and engagement through scholar activism and intersectionality, especially for students from refugee families and from women of color. Okay, and so next to Vanessa, yay. I'm sorry, I'm gonna go a little fast, I'm taking up a lot of time. Juliet Shen is next to Vanessa, is a senior at the University of Albany at New York, where she studies political science and sociology. She is the co-chair and co-founder of the Coalition of API Americans collaborating together. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. To unite the Southwest, Cactus, and a blogger at fascinationblog.com. She has worked with New York Students Rising, ICASU, East Coast Asian American Student Union, and the Japanese American Citizens League. She currently works as the social media coordinator for 18 Million Rising, a nonprofit geared towards promoting activism amongst Asian Americans. And last but not least, we have Daniel Hodendot at the end, who is the programming chair for the Asian Student Council at Rutgers University. He also serves as the director of advocacy at ICASU, which again is the East Coast Asian American Students Union, and is involved with OCA, Asian Pacific American Advocates. He will be pursuing a master's degree in higher education after graduating from Rutgers in May 2015. So thank you so much to our esteemed panel for being with us tonight. And I want to start out by offering the mic to Professor Cooper here, who's going to make some brief remarks to respond to Professor Chang's talk, and then we will start our conversation. Thank you very much.
Good evening, everybody. So this is awesome for me because I love Jeff Chang. I have both of his books and was going to bring, and I have the original copies, the big hard copies, so I was going to bring them both over here, but I didn't want to be a nerd. So I left the first one at home, but you're going to have to sign the second one. And so this is really a treat. He's one of our most formidable thinkers about the relationship of culture to art and politics, and respects us enough to write in an accessible way, but to not dumb down for his audience. And that's a gift and it's a talent and a set of skills that folks cultivate that not everyone has. So thank you so much, Jeff. One of the things that I really appreciate is you asking us to think about the language of dreaming, which is a thing that I've been thinking a lot about too, because we're in this moment where we're commemorating so many things from 50 years ago. And so there's a particular kind of politics to dreaming, right? And I'm thinking about this because I'm thinking about how the thing that brings our sense of dreaming into politics is King's iconic "I Have a Dream" speech from 1963. But one of the women that I write about talks about how when she went to the "I Have a Dream" speech to the March on Washington, that she was irritated with King because she wished that what he had said was "We have a dream." Right? Such a simple shift, but a hugely important one, right? That it wasn't just about his own sense of who America could be, but about what our collaborative, democratic sense of the nation we're trying to be is. And so I would ask us to think a lot about, and more critically about, and more intentionally about, what our collective dream and sense of ourself is. Right? I think this is a moment where, to the extent that we still believe in the American project, and I don't always know that I believe in it, as protesters in Wisconsin are taking over to protest the killing of Tony Robinson, a 19-year-old kid, on Friday, and this seems to be happening every week. One of my good friends calls this week another hashtag memorial. Every week, it seems that another young black man in particular has been killed, but this is also happening to young Latinos and also happening to young women of color. I don't know that I believe, but to the extent that I do, the question I think that is before us is, what kind of nation will we be? And who gets to determine that? And I think that one of the things that you point us to, Jeff, is that while there's a significant demographic of folks in this country, largely over the age of 65, who thinks that they will determine that. And they are quickly trying to lay the architecture so that long after they are no longer the majority, we will be living with the impact of white supremacy, which is a term we should say. We run from it because it's so harsh. It's also very true, right? So they're laying the architecture for us to have a generational residue of white supremacy that we're combating long after they are no longer the majority. But I think that what you point us to is that it's up to folks in this room, people who look like the demographic of people in this room, to determine what kind of country we will be. And so we have to begin now to really articulate a set of politics, because look, just because we're people of color and we have lived with marginalization doesn't mean that our politics are necessarily radical, are necessarily progressive, right? Because very frequently, when the only model that we have about how to rule is one of dominance, if that is what we allow the vision to be, that is what we will aspire to do, right? So we have to think beyond what we have seen to what is possible, right? And so that is what the language of dreams suggests to me, is that it gives us the opportunity to think about what is possible. And so that is why I love the title of Jeff's book as well, Who We Be, right? It's both question and assertion at the same time, right? It is about a sense of moxie and a comportment, right? About what we're gonna take, what we're gonna accept, this ain't who we be, right? So you really gotta get the sense of that and what is possible and what it invites us into in the way of conversation. Another thing I'll say, and I want to keep this brief because I want us to be able to have the full conversation, is stake your generational territory and don't apologize for it. Don't apologize for it. I care a lot about respecting elders because I'm Southern. And black and Christian sometimes. And so respecting elders is a thing that matters a lot. But there's a way to be respectful of what we have, right? Of what elders have given us. And I do think we can build on this moment by saying that we don't arrive here where we can all sit in this room on Livingston campus given its history of struggle, unless there were elders who did significant work to make that possible. But we don't have to be limited by their achievements, right? Or their sense of how we ought to do it. And that's gonna lead to some clashes, because maybe you wanna go to the protest in your pants sag. Real talk. And if you're anything like me, maybe you cuss like a sailor, so you're not particularly interested in a sort of corporate English language approach to asserting your right to have your life protected and respected, right? So I want to just encourage you to own this. And so don't let people diminish what you're doing by calling it hacktivism and slacktivism, right? You guys can send out a tweet and mobilize hundreds and thousands of people to come to a place and show up and say, we're not going to take this anymore. And that's something our elders only dreamed of doing, and you largely sat in rooms with telephones, not smartphones, telephones, and had to call and spend hours and hours calling and mobilizing. And now you guys can do it at the drop of a hat. And I think that there's a move then to diminish that, right? And to say, well, that's not real activism. I've even heard it from young folks. Well, those people don't get in the streets. But look, more people get in the streets than would have before. That's always a small number, right? But you should never judge your movement by the masses of people that get in the streets. The real movers who have the time to devote to activism is usually a small number compared to everybody else. Right, and so if you're only in it because you need to see 100,000 folks get out in the street every time, you're going to be disappointed very often. But that doesn't mean that you're not shifting the culture. I watched 5 folks take over a highway in Atlanta and shut down I-85, I-75, and if you've ever lived there, that's not nice to do to anybody. So in other words, I'm simply saying that I think that this is a moment to recalibrate expectations, to believe mightily in your own power, and to recognize that believing in that power and respecting that power, not apologizing for it, is not the same thing as disrespecting the past and the shoulders upon which you stand, right? I watched Diane Nash, who was one of the architects of Selma, choose not to march this weekend. She wouldn't march. And she didn't march because George W. Bush marched. And she said, he's a warmonger, and I was part of a nonviolent movement, and I won't march with him. That is a deeply principled stance, because Selma is so much her moment, and she has been eluded from the conversation so much. So you can tell that for her, it was very much about a set of principles and a world she wanted to build, not about the commemoration, not about people recognizing her face or her name or her voice. Now, I think she probably could levy that same kind of charge against Obama, and I think we can ask that question too. But those are the things that I'm thinking. Believe in your own power. Recognize the politics of dreaming, that it's our dream to construct together. It's not any one person's dream. And so in the spirit of saying it's our dream to construct together, make sure that the dream is all races and all classes and all genders, cisgender and transgender, and all sexual identities, queer sexual identities, and heterosexual identities if hetero folks can act right. Right? Real talk. And we'll bring white folks along too if they can act right. Right? The whole point is you gotta act right. We'll bring everybody that's willing to act right. Okay? But make sure when I say we, I really mean that, and we have to be explicit about what that we means, because we are also in a moment where we run the risk of having a limited framework for whose lives matter. And I think Black lives matter. I want to be very clear, but not just Black men's lives, not just straight Black folks' lives, not just cisgender Black folks' lives, right? All Black lives, right? And when we then can say all Black lives, then we're in the position to talk about all other lives, right? So those are my thoughts. Thank you so much, Jeff.
All right, thank you so much, Professor Cooper. So I want to start by opening up the floor to everyone on the panel, and then hopefully opening up the floor to you. I want to start first with this, the we. Okay, so we have a panel tonight, and I want to just have everyone kind of express a term I use with my students all the time is epistemology. How do we know what we know? Because of where we come from. That's Ron Takaki, a professor in ethics studies at Berkeley. So I want to start by acknowledging that we have a plethora and a range of knowledge and approaches to that dream, right, sitting right here on the panel. So I wanted to go, just maybe go down the line and have our young activists hopefully start first by telling us about who you are and how you came to this work and how you see digital media and social activism as, a part of that work. Why are you an activist in 2015 when we are leaving you, our generation, with this incredibly fraught landscape, political landscape? And how do you think about that landscape and how you approach it? So you can take your answer to kind of talk about what you're doing and maybe tease out some of the issues that Professor Cooper and Professor Chang have brought up already. So maybe Daniel, we can start on the end with you.
So hi, my name's Daniel, and I'm a first-generation Korean American adoptee. So for me, I grew up in a community that was predominantly white, and the only other people that I could identify with were the 3 other adoptees on my street. So for me, my work that I got involved with the CASU was heavily through that I couldn't find a way to learn about my adoption community. So I saw a CASU as a way that we could really start a conversation on it. And during this time, there were documentaries and other adoptees that were already working on this. So I think for me, then through that, once we got involved, we created programming that educated the rest of our community on adoption. And now we're seeing a lot more organizations. Jenna Yuskowitz actually just started an adoption organization on a national level. So we're actually getting a lot of more public space, which is really great. That's all.
Hi everyone, my name's Juliet. I kind of got my start, actually, I was telling them earlier that I really got involved with activism and organizing through higher education. I am an out-of-state student at SUNY Albany, which is a state school in New York. I'm originally from Arizona, and the instant that I stepped onto campus, I found out that the SUNY system had cut French, Italian, theater, classics, and Russian. And they were also planning to raise tuition 10% each year for out-of-state students, I think about 4% each year for in-state students. And so that, at the very core of it, as Professor Cooper said, I swear like a sailor as well. So, is it okay if I swear? Okay, I'm sorry, I wanted to double check.
Take it away.
That shit really pissed me off. Like, I came all the way here to an Arctic tundra to study, and I get to a school that doesn't care about humanities, it doesn't care about ethnic studies. Our East Asian Studies department, first, only focuses on East Asians. Second, doesn't talk about Asian American things. So I started getting really pissed off, and I started organizing with several other students in Albany. And that led me to blogging about what it meant to be Asian American. I kind of had this identity peak where I kind of realized that assimilation wasn't the answer for me. So I wanted to make a very clear stance on where I came from, where I stand today, and who I am. And that kind of led me into blogging. Blogging led me into tweeting. I didn't have much of a community growing up in Arizona that was accessible to talk about what it meant to be Asian American, what it meant to grow up in Arizona. So, I would read websites like Angry Asian Man. I would read excerpts of books online. I went on Tumblr and I looked at what it meant to be Asian American. And I ended up finding my community there. I found my chosen family online. And both people sitting next to me I met online. And, we're all very close friends now. So for me, it's always been kind of finding that community and seeing how accessible it can be. I have kind of anxiety when talking to people in person. It's gotten better throughout the years, but organizing online, talking to hundreds or thousands of people through Twitter, through Facebook, through Tumblr, through Reddit, it gives me an opportunity to make connections and build coalitions and bridges with people. And that kind of relates to my work with 18 Million Rising as well. I think those who have mental health issues or are disabled and can't physically show up, can't physically take to the streets, the internet is an amazing way for people of all backgrounds to do that, Like, how many people would have necessarily heard about what happened in Ferguson had it not been for the internet? We sure as hell know that mainstream media is not going to cover that. Right. So it's like, for us, it's about, I think that the dream that 18 Million Rising has, that I have as well, is that now is the time for us to really take the spotlight, not even try to demand a seat at the table, but to create our own table where everyone has a seat, no matter what. And it's our story, and it's our time to tell it.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here on a Monday night. I don't know if I could do this if I was on my own campus. We're in finals right now, so I'm actually really happy I'm not there. But my name is Vanessa Tech. I'm a master's student in higher education at the University of Denver. And I think it's really important for me to talk about my journey in activism as something that's in my blood. My family came over to the United States in the 1980s as refugees from Cambodia, a terrible genocide, and it's a miracle that my family survived. So I often speak about how survival is in my blood. I don't know anything else. And a lot of my activism is rooted in healing from assimilation. Julia, we both grew up in the Southwest, which is why we have this close relationship. Because my family faced so much trauma in coming to the United States, in learning English, and wanting to belong, and to just be safe, I was removed from my community. I didn't know any other Cambodian Americans growing up, let alone Asian Americans. I was asked not to speak my language at home, at school. And for a really long time, actually, until maybe senior year of high school, I thought I was white. And it was really difficult for me to come under the realization that this is internalized oppression, and that I was pretending to be something that I wasn't because I wanted to fit in, continue to fit in into a society that continues to criminalize, deport, and make invisible my community. So now that I am in higher education, now that I actually have the opportunity to understand my narrative, understand where my family came from, understand the history that brought me here, I don't see any other path that I can take, right? It's my right and it's my privilege to be able to bring the Cambodian American voice to the table. I think that I've found organizing in Asian American spaces challenging and rewarding because the dominant narrative is of East Asian Americans, right? When I talk to people about being Cambodian American, they're one, either surprised, or two, have said, oh, I've never met a Cambodian American before. So it's been extremely interesting to disrupt the privilege in that space. I think that as Asian Americans, we sit in a very unique space in organizing where a lot of our communities are extremely privileged, but at the same time, a lot of our communities are below the poverty line. I know very few Cambodian Americans who have graduated high school, and it's difficult to fit that narrative into this idea of Asian Americans being the model minority and successful. Just terrible, disgusting things. And I started getting involved in social media activism because I didn't have a community in Colorado. Interestingly enough, I somehow ended up going to the Midwest to understand my Asian American identity. I don't know why I didn't go to California, and met my community there. And through that, I met Julia. Through that, I met Daniel. And we were just having a conversation earlier, saying random names and seeing that we all knew each other. And I think it's absolutely incredible that social media has the ability to bring together these people from so many different places, and to have these chosen families on the West Coast, on the East Coast, in the Midwest, in the Southwest with Cactus. And to not only dialogue with each other, but to heal with each other and to love each other. And social media has really given me that love. So thank you all for having us here.
Hi, I'm Donna. I think also my reflection on my own activist work over the many years that it seems like I've been around is also to start with my family. I come from a family of activists. My great-grandmother was active in an array of causes until she was in her 80s. The last thing that she used to do consistently was to work on issues of advocacy for elderly people in the state of Pennsylvania, which is where I grew up. And so I think to a certain extent, I'm, And it's interesting because, you know, in this moment, I'm actually reflecting on that now because I'm at that point in my life where, you know, a lot of those folks are gone, and I'm realizing that I'm kind of becoming the elder, right, in my family, and, you know, trying to grapple with that legacy and figure out what it means. You know, so for me, I guess, you know, I started to kind of do things, I guess, in the world, or try to make change in the world as a high school student. I grew up in Pittsburgh. We were in a school that was probably about 60 to 65% Black. We didn't have any curriculum that kind of reflected that. We didn't have African American history in, you know, you had that kind of like one chapter, right, in U.S. history class where it was like, yeah, you know, Black folks came over from Africa, Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves, Martin Luther King had a dream, hallelujah, amen, we've all overcome, right, you know? And so then you just kind of like, okay, but there's more, and, you know, why are we in this space, right, with the demographics that we have, and what we're learning doesn't reflect that. And this was a question these were conversations I had with my peers, these were conversations that I would attempt to have with some of my teachers, some of them more receptive than others. And so there was a group of students, a group of Black students in the school, and we used to get together. It was kind of a safe space for us. You know, we talked about, you know, the things that we experienced, particularly those of us who were in kind of the honors track, right, where we might be, given the demographics of our school, we're like the one kid in the honors class, which is, you know, an interesting irony, right? You know, and so this kind of became a space where we decided, well, we need to do something about this. So we, you know, with the help of some of the Black faculty, we were able to kind of advocate to have a Black history course added to the curriculum the following year. And so, I don't know, I think I've been doing various things since then, right? I got to Rutgers, I was also an undergraduate here at Rutgers. I was involved in various attempts to, you know, we organized around Rodney King, right? You know, it was a really interesting moment for me, actually, just in the last few months, right? My daughter is a freshman here. And in the aftermath of the Rodney King verdict, we didn't have social media back in the Stone Age then, right? You know, but it was an interesting moment. I talked about this before when we were on that last panel about how that Rodney King incident was, for us, it was one of those moments where there was a visual, right? And there was never a visual before. I mean, people got beat by the cops all the time, and, you know, but nobody but us could witness that. And we felt like, okay, the whole community could see this. So clearly, you know, something has got to happen, and it didn't. And so we were like, you know, I mean, that was a really interesting moment there. And so as students on the Rutgers campus, actually, we got together, word of mouth, whatever, right after the verdict, and we organized to shut down Route 18. And then my daughter, when I was out of town, with the weekend of the protests that were here on campus, and she's like sending me pictures on my phone, like, Mom, look, we shut down Route 18. And I'm like, great, I'm really proud of her, but that was a hell of a moment, right? Where it's like, you know, that deja vu, I'm like, I'm gonna try not to cuss, right? But like that was, you know, so it was this really interesting kind of moment to reflect upon how much has changed and how much has really not. And so some of my current work, so for me, like, I think activism, and, you know, you see something, it's not right, you got to do something about it, because this is what the people around me did, right, you know, in my family. And so for me, like, I come to kind of social media activism as to the extent that I do that sort of thing. I'm currently involved with a group known as Muslim Anti-Racism Collaborative, which exists primarily online, right? You know, a lot of the activities is in education and advocacy work, which educates the general public around issues of racism relating both external to the Muslim community, and, you know, issues like Islamophobia directed towards Muslims as a whole, but also deals with intra-Muslim racism, right? Because the American Muslim community in the United States is something like 80 nationalities, right? And clearly there's a lot of inter-ethnic conflict there. But I come to social media you know, for me it's a tool, right? I mean, I'm kind of pragmatic that way. What I want to see is change. And so I'm like, whatever we got phones, we got, you know, radio, we got whatever it is that we have, right? This is what we need to be using, because these issues are broad, deep, intractable, multifaceted, And so our techniques have to also reflect that. So if social media can get people out on the street, if it can get, if it can get attention, if it can get whatever, word. At the end of the day, I think it really, our conversations about what's useful and what's not, that really has to be what drives these conversations, right? Not so much, well, is it real, is it live, or is it Memorex, or whatever, right? I'm really showing my age here with that. Right? It's like, does it do the work? Does it advance the work, right? And so, and I think we can overwhelmingly say that social media has advanced the work, right? There's so much proof for that it's almost not worth repeating, right? Because it's clearly it's there. The Madison thing, I was just thinking about this issue of like time compression, right, this morning, right, where, he was killed on Friday and people was out the streets deep.
They shut down the state capitol
today. That was today, right? Yeah, so students, high school students shut down the state capitol, and that type of instant, that type of spontaneity, right, is something that social media really enables, and it's something, so you can't really, so these divisions between like virtual and real activism, I think are generally advanced by people who have no idea what the hell they're talking about.
Awesome. Jeff and Brittany, did you guys want to respond, or did you want to? Well, thank you so much. I just wanted to give everyone a sense of the incredibly wide range of work people are doing. And what I noticed when I was listening, and maybe a little bit of a generational thing with Donna and some of the younger activists, is that this idea that the digital space becomes a place to find community, right? We live incredibly busy lives. Busyness is like the new status symbol. Oh, we're so busy, right, all the time. And so almost the internet becomes both a safe space and a dangerous space, right, at the same time. It's a space where we can find community and build relationships and find those dreamers that are dreaming those same places. But it's also a site of surveillance, of profiling, where you can be trolled, bullied, denigrated, and you have to be quite careful. So I wonder if you guys could all talk about, your own experiences of how real is that community that you find? If we're talking about moment or movement, like, are those communities really about those kind of personal interactions, or is there something larger that you are seeking? Is it an ever-evolving type of search? And I want to hear this about, kind of where does it go? Like, this is what my students always say. So, okay, we sign the petition, we do this, now what? What do we do? Where does it go? So I wonder if anyone has any thoughts on that. I'm going to leave that open, and soon I want to open up the floor to some of your questions as well. So where do we go with these amazing communities that we build?
I can take it.
Absolutely, please do.
Okay, so I guess the first example that came to mind was there's this recent immigration case that's kind of flooding Asian America right now about this woman named Nanhui Cho, and she's this Korean single mother, survivor of abuse, and she's a survivor of abuse, and she's a mother, and she's being threatened with deportation because her abusive partner's suing her for a child abduction. And there's almost no media coverage of it besides social media. And so there's petitions, but then there's also like very clear instructions on what to do, to call the field directors of ICE and tell them to release their hold on her, so that even if she goes to jail, she's not going to get deported to Korea. That's one example. As for the communities, I think that it's very diverse. There's a huge range. There are the people who I only talk to on Facebook if I'm in their city or if we're going to be on a panel together. But then there's people like Vanessa who's become one of my closest friends, and I don't remember how we met. I think it was on Tumblr. Yeah. But it's all about like for me, my closest friends are spread out around the country. And that means that when I'm doing speaking things like this, I can hit them up and be like, hey, I'm in your relative region, which means, I'm kind of on the East Coast, kind of in the Midwest. And oftentimes, like, you'll find a lot of people willing to, like, drive hours or take a bus hours to, like, meet up with you, because even if you only see each other twice a year, once a year, those, like, 10 minutes of interaction added on to the hours and hours of online interaction builds up to an amazing friendship. And then just like, I'm gonna use you as an example, but so on my blog I received some anonymous messages, and like there was one that says, oh, you love the work you do, you deserve everything good. And that message, I held on to that message for so long, and it really like made my month. And someone came up to me right before the panel, was like, hey, I sent you an anonymous message. She's like right there. And I was like, what? So it's kind of like, online, it's kind of, I guess it's kind of a paradox. You never know who's going to see the things that you say. You never know who's going to be impacted by the things that you do, but at the same time, you can also kind of track it in a way. That goes back to the surveillance thing. You can see who's liking it, who's following it, who's retweeting it, who's reblogging it. And that's kind of like, it makes everyone online feel a little bit less alone in their thoughts. It makes you feel like, hey, I'm not the only one who feels this way. I'm not the only one who thinks this way. And that's the sense of community that I have from the internet.
Let me share a little bit. So I think a couple things. Mostly, I think of online interactions as positive. In 2010, I was a professor at the University of Alabama. So I was living in Alabama, and my good friend and colleague from grad school was living in a different part of Alabama. And so we were two black women, young black women in our late 20s, isolated, and looking for community and looking for ways to think about the experiences that we were having. And here's the thing. I'm older than you, but not substantially older than you. And so one of the things that we were thinking about is what it meant to be young 20-something professors in the academy as black women, and to be dealing with microaggressions, right? To be dealing with all manner of assertions about our competence, our ability, all of those things. And so we created, we had called ourselves the Crunk Feminist Collective since grad school, because we lived in Atlanta. Crunk music was hot. It's still hot today. And so we were going out a lot. That was our way of like decompressing. And so we created this hip hop generation feminist community online, and it remains today. We just turned 5 last week, and it remains today an amazing space for us to think about issues that matter to us around feminism, around pop culture, around social justice, and around what it means to be an academe and to try to have a critical, radical politic. And then, so I also work with Black Lives Matter, like the official organizing team for Black Lives Matter. And we knew each other largely online. And during Labor Day weekend, we were like, so we're going to Ferguson, because what the world, like, what the fuck are they doing, And we raised money to take, to send people from across the country, California, Chicago, Detroit, and then we came from New York, New Jersey, and Philly, and we took a bus. And we were on that bus together for 40 hours, around 20 going, 20 coming. But we met online, and then that turned into an interaction outside of the virtual world. And now we see each other once a month. Like, we make it a point. We have meetings, we do things, so we stay connected online, but we also have real, like I hung out with them on Friday. We have real tangible connections. So those are real relationships, and they feel like family, and they feel very sustainable. The other side, though, of Professor Chan Malik's question, I think is important. But there is surveillance, and there is a risk and a cost. So in my inbox now, I also have like a detective from Rutgers PD following up with me about the death threats I got months ago. Or there was the nasty little incident last spring where I wrote something in my weekly column at Salon, and Bill O'Reilly got a hold of it on Fox News and profiled me. And so I got harassed, and so some of my colleagues here at the university also got harassed every day, getting hate mail and hate phone calls. So we don't always think about, and I do try to say to my students, be mindful of what you put online. I'm a writer who writes about very personal aspects of my life online, and so I try to have some safeguards against that. Like when I do public stuff, like when I do HuffPost Live, I don't put the city in New Jersey where I live. Like I try to make small I mean, not that it's a lot of protection, but it's something. It makes person go an extra step if they really want to. But I worry about this because we work and learn at a public institution, and I have had threats around that, and because folks can find us here easily, our offices where we teach, those are questions that we have to ask. I do think that the movement that we're building, and I do think we're building a movement. I do think that the movement will have to think about the issue of surveillance, right? That if we're spreading stuff via text messages, like during the Black Power era, COINTELPRO was a real thing, right? Where they surveilled and tapped phones, and now we put everything in text messages and on Facebook. And your private Facebook group, if someone wants to know what you're doing, they can hack it. It's not.
It's my tracking device.
That's right. So, so I really do think that we have to think about that. But I think the levels of connectivity matter so much. But I do worry about the fact that we put so much online. And I worry about what it means that we're also doing this on privately owned platforms. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Twitter is privately owned. Facebook is privately owned. Now, in a world where the founders of Twitter wake up someday and say, we're tired of this. We did this in our 20s and 30s, and we sort of don't want to do it anymore. What if that happened tomorrow? Because theoretically, they could just shut it down tomorrow and say, we don't want to do this anymore. We own it, and we're just tired of it. Then what do? Right? So we should think about a world in which, while we have created amazing social revolution and connection in these social media platforms, like at CFC, we have a blog, we have a Tumblr, we have a Facebook, we have a Twitter. All of those are privately owned, and if at any point any of them shuts down, all we will have is the blogs on our website, but the community we built, we won't have any way to access it. Right? Because we don't have everybody's email, and we don't want all those people to have our emails. So I think that there's a push-pull here. But like many of you, I've thrown my lot in with I want the community, and I'm sort of addicted to it at this point. So I'm just hoping that someone has some ethics somewhere, and that they won't take our lives away. Right? Yeah.
I'm sorry. I mean, that question of surveillance is particularly poignant for me right now, particularly because of who I am, right? I sit at the intersection of, this conversation on out of control cops and law enforcement is on the one hand, might get shot. On the other hand, because I look like this, right? The government is all up in my beeswax, right? I mean, and so in both of the communities, I guess, that I belong to, there's a lawsuit, right, Hassan versus the state of New York, which affected students at Rutgers, right? Because the the NYPD was spying on students from upstate New York to Philadelphia, right, outside of jurisdiction, gathering whatever even just where you have dinner at, right, as some kind of matter of law enforcement interest. So, the question of surveillance is particularly relevant to me, and should be relevant to all of you, because that impacted students on this campus, for sure. So I don't even know, the thing is, it's one of those things that it's hard to even wrap your head around, it, right, because I'm a student of history, I know about COINTELPRO, and I know about the precursors to COINTELPRO, right, as a black Muslims in this country were being surveilled by the FBI in the 1930s, right? So this goes way back. It's not new, but it's one thing to know it, and there's another thing to know it, right? When you know that law enforcement officers, right? We were just talking about this on the way over here. When the Department of Homeland Security shows up at your mosque on Friday, you go there to pray, and it's like DHS is in the house. It's a real. Yeah, the words that I have, I don't know that I have words for it. Just to kind of work your way out of that mentally and figure out what to do about it is a serious kind of thing. So we should be aware of it. Then at the same time, the thing is, they're going to be looking at me anyway. They're going to be spying on me. This NYPD, they was logging where people had chicken wings. What's suspicious about that? So you know what? I might as well give them something to talk about.
And you might as well have chicken wings.
Right, because I I've said this, and I was in California last week, and we were talking about, like Black Lives Matter and, you know, and kind of the intersection of like these different things, Islamophobia and Black Lives Matter, and I'm like, I mean, I'm afraid for my life as a Black person in this nation. I mean, that's not hyperbole. That's not an exaggeration. It's not, I am a person who, because I inhabit this body, because my loved ones inhabit the bodies that they inhabit, that their safety is not a given. And when they're in there, because Tony Robinson was shot at his home. You ain't even got to leave the crib. You know what I'm saying? So yeah, I mean, the surveillance question is there, but like, what else you gonna do? Because they gonna come for you anyway.
Yeah, the surveillance state is not new, right? The surveillance state, if you're Black in this country, and if you're Muslim in this country, is not new, right? It's on fleek because of, yes, I said it. You know, because of social media and because of broad digital access, but these things are not new. And so, but part of what that means to me is that we should be looking to people of color to theorize how we get out of this, because this is our regular condition. What's shifting is that white people are now getting a taste of being in a surveillance state, right? I think white folks are starting to, I think when everybody saw those tanks roll into Ferguson, everybody was like, whoa, this is not what we signed up for. And I think that it's now a moment where everybody's like the thing that Black and brown folks know in this country, and I mean brown in all shades, right, is that if it happens to us, white people are not that far behind. They actually aren't, right? Like, it was like Reaganomics in the 80s, right? It was really a backlash against civil rights and left-wing politics, but ultimately it hurt the white middle class too. You know, it's the thing Jeff was saying in his talk about how you have people voting against their own class interest because of racism, right? So, you know, that's the thing that we can also share. Like, dude, like, this is gonna hurt you too. It doesn't just hurt us. This fire touches you too, and you won't just get singed eyebrows at the end. You burn the house down, the whole shit goes, right? You know?
I think that's a great point. I think Julia and I, just kind of going off topic, but on topic with what you said, became really close because we hold our community accountable for anti-Blackness. Anti-Blackness is rampant in the Asian American community, and I accept that. Like, that, I know that exists, and I'm not going to pretend to ignore it, and it's a matter of making sure our community opens their eyes and recognizes that too, right? We have all internalized oppression. We all commit oppression. A lot of us remix oppression so that we can gain visibility by dominating others in the conversation. And that's not healthy, right? We're talking about liberation, we're talking about revolution, but that doesn't actually exist if you're committing the same type of oppression that's been done to you, right? We need to disrupt that. If we're going to have a real revolution, we need to disrupt those systems of power, right? We can't reenact them. So by holding our community accountable, even though they are people who look like me, even though they are people from my family, people from my community, if they are saying anything anti-Black, anything that is oppressive, anything that is racist, sexist, etc., ableist, I gotta hold them accountable. I gotta call their shit out, because if I let that pass, it's almost saying as if that it's okay. It's a lot of people I think that I've interacted with have said it's a cultural thing. They grew up that way, their parents were that way, their family was that way, but why does that need to continue, right? Just because it's the way we've always done it doesn't mean that we need to continue doing it that way. So I think before we're able to make any type of change, before we're able to concentrate on that wave and that process that you were mentioning, we really do need to reflect more on ourselves and how we have internalized that impression and continue to commit it as well. And I don't think that any change can happen before you do that. So.
Yeah, and just kind of jumping in on that as well. I mean, that involves classism as well. I think one of the most horrifying moments of my life was when, so our friendship actually began because we got fired from the same organization together because we made a video criticizing the fact he worked for it too, but he didn't get fired. We criticized this, I call them a legacy organization because I don't think that they're actually doing the work to deserve being called a civil rights organization. And they're like 80% funded by Walmart, and that you can't claim to fight for, communities of color and fight for, workers' rights if you're being funded by Walmart. So we got fired for that. So it's kind of like holding our communities accountable and asking the tough questions is definitely a huge part.
Daniel, do you want to add anything?
I think I'll just save time.
Okay, so I want to open up for questions, but I just wanted to kind of ask Professor Chang if he had any thoughts about, hearing this incredibly wide range, because first of all, as I said in my introduction, we come from a place in the aftermath of the 1992 LA uprisings in which there was these enormous conflicts that I think were projected in a way between Black and Asian communities. In a way in which, George Lipsitz very famously calls it crabs in a barrel. People all thinking they're going to claw to get this one thing and being pitted against each other. And I'm hearing here, these amazing young activists and thinkers and scholars saying, this is not really what's happening, though this kind of culture and climate is still being fostered by, a lot of dominant narratives. So I wonder if, Jeff, you could remark on just thinking about what is actually going on. Like, what is 2015, coalition building? What is this new culture? And what can we all bring to the table to make that new table for us?
Well, I think what's really exciting about everybody's sort of witnessing and testimony here is that the opportunity for us, because of our technology now, is to be able to actually see what's happening with everybody else at the same time. And in that respect, it's a different moment than it was in 1965, because we're able to use the technology actually to be able to express all these different aspects of our identities, which are very rich and layered and multiple, and which in previous movements, we often had to suppress parts of ourselves in order to advance other causes. And so all of the work can actually happen at the same time because of the kind of technology that we have. And so it's not about all of us getting together and forming one wave. It's about the fact that we're building these, everybody's building their own kinds of waves at the same time. And so that when there's a pressure point or there's a catalytic moment, these waves take shape and they go. So that Black Lives Matter starts up after the Trayvon Martin killing and the verdict that acquitted George Zimmerman, and that Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders who support the notion of fighting anti-Black racism can follow in that. One of the things that I think that we are seeing here is the ability to be able to make those kinds of connections very quickly. But the other thing that happens is, of course, we're incredibly fragmented all of the time. And that's the other thing that social media is doing. And so we can't see the kinds of connections that are happening right in front of us. So just to expand, for instance, on what you're talking about with surveillance, right? The reason that you have the militarization of the police in Ferguson, which is a resegregated neighborhood, right? Used to be an all-white town, right? And when we talk about gentrification in the cities, people are forced out somewhere. So they're forced into the Sanfords, they're forced into the Fergusons, they're forced into these cities that used to be all white when whites were fleeing the inner city. And now that whites are coming back to the city, there's talk about gentrification, but we really have to understand the bigger problem, which is resegregation, right? And so you have a war happening, and there's surplus technology because we're putting all of this money into the defense industry, and all these weapons get created, and they end up somewhere, and then you sort of scale back your war front operations in Afghanistan and Iraq, and where does it go? Well, it gets tested on the border, right? We militarize the border. We've militarized the border at the same time that we've been militarizing the country for war, right? And so all of that stuff is getting tested in the desert, right? On the border. And it's also getting tested, and it's also getting sent into these resegregated cities in which it's predominantly African American, or predominantly Latino, or predominantly Asian American, or predominantly Native American. That's where the weapons are all going. So all of these issues are interconnected, and it just takes a little bit of sleuthing on the web to see all this stuff connected. And so I think, you know, the idea that the Zapatistas had is that you create a movement of movements, right? That everybody is working on all their different types of issues, but they're understanding the deep interconnections that make it possible for these oppressive systems to continue, right? And it's not necessarily even about taking power, it's about deconstructing that power and bringing that power back down to the people where it belongs. So I think that that's sort of the way that we get to change, the way that we think about building movements out of these moments that are happening.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So we have, the program is technically supposed to end at 10, but I'm happy to stay and talk. We would love to open up the floor to any of your comments, questions, queries. We have the microphones on both sides if anybody wants to come up to the mic. So don't all come at once. You know, while you queue up. Oh, did you have a question right here?
Oh, wow, I thought like.
Do you need a minute?
No, I have a question.
Okay, great, awesome, please, please.
Yeah, okay. So my question is, you know, going online with the title of the program, Moment or Movement, I think it's very well known for people who I hang out with that social media is a tool for change. But my question is, where do you go from there? And I think that's the next step, kind of, because often I hear that while we're using social media to like harness power and come together because we're all like pissed off, we're also upset because I feel like every year we come back to the table with the same situation and another hashtag that represents another name. So what's the next step after that?
I think a thing to say, in addition to whatever my colleagues might add, is to recognize that movements take a really long time to build. And unfortunately, we have mistaken the sort of speeding up of digital time with the speeding up of movement time. And those things don't quite go together. So when we're thinking about the 50 years that we've been commemorating, let's think how many 50-year anniversaries we've been commemorating. So we were doing 63, 64, 65, right? And when you think about there's 61 freedoms, the freedom rides, but if you think, you know, so I tell people all the time, the Montgomery bus boycott was in 1955, the freedom rides were in 1961. That's a 6-year time difference, right? So we think of those all now as one movement. Desegregation comes as a court order in 54. Right, but in the 1970s, they're bringing cases again to the Supreme Court because those places are not desegregating quickly, even though the ruling is all deliberate speed. Right, right. So, one, I think we have to slow down. One of my friends and colleagues from Ferguson, Janetta Elzy, says, "Look, there is no handbook for what we're doing. We're building a new movement." I think that's one thing. The second thing I think is, Can black folks be pissed off? Can young folks be pissed off? Like, can you have a moment to express rage and trauma? How about that, right? Like, if we actually acknowledge the magnitude of what happens when every week you have to hear about another person your age who was killed by the police, that is significant trauma. And it bothers me when we say to folks, like, be really mad because you just keep watching people get killed. Now tell us what we're gonna do to change America. We've been trying to figure that shit out for 200 and something years. And they want you to figure out in one or 2 years because you're tired. Well, our folks were tired of being lynched, but that went on for decades and decades and decades too. And our folks were tired of Jim Crow, and that went on for decades and decades too. Now, I don't think that this has to go on for decades. I do think we can learn the lessons, but I also think there's something really powerful about not speeding you to the procedural work of movement building. And I think that America actually needs to sit with the discomfort of witnessing black pain and black rage, right? Because people are taking our lives and our kids' lives and the lives of people we care about. So why can't we fucking sit with black rage, right? So there's that. The third thing I think is there is an agenda, right? The Black Lives Matter movement has laid out a clear agenda that says, look, we want to we want to defund police. We want to put them on a federal oversight system. We want to grade them. If they don't pass, we want to defund those systems, and we want to reroute that money into public schools. We want to cease all selling of military equipment to police departments. We want a comprehensive reporting system for killing, because part of the reason we don't know the extent of the problem is because not all police departments report all folks that they kill and the races of the people that they kill. And then there are a couple more prongs to that as well. So there actually is an agenda for things for us to fight for. And so now becomes the work of organizing. Y'all have been mobilizing people. We've been mobilizing people via social media. Now, it's one of the other planks is getting local city councils to issue resolutions around, so moratoriums around use of excessive force or not killing unarmed people, right? Like, I'm sorry? Right, that's right. So also community policing standards and measures, right? So there actually is an agenda. And that's just the policing agenda, right? There should also, let me say too, you're in the space of the university. So I'm not gonna say too much because I don't have tenure. But, but I would encourage you guys to think about how universities are funded. And I would encourage you guys to begin thinking about issues of privatization of public schooling at the K through 12 level and the university level, right? Thinking about that as a broad kind of problem. Because look, it doesn't matter if you stop policing if you still keep putting people in the school to prison pipeline, right? So we do have an agenda. So don't let people tell you don't have an agenda. Now you just have to figure out how to move it forward. But you got a plan of action to go, right? Yeah.
If, just quickly, everything she said, like, amen, hallelujah, right? But I just wanted to pick up a little bit on that question of, because I've been thinking a lot about what protests do, right? And I think there's a number, and I said in some other forum recently, like there's a number of levels at which you can actually answer that question, right? And if you all will forgive a shameless self-plug here, actually I wrote a piece that is available on the internet about my experiences with a die-in, right? And it wasn't about policy, right? It's, the title of the piece is Recall to Life, the Meaning and Power of a Die-in. And really, it was just like, we were at the convention, the conference for the American Anthropological Association in the fall. And my colleagues organized a die-in in the middle of the lobby where we were convening, right? So there's a bunch of academics, right? There was a die-in, and like, that was the day after the Eric Garner announcement in New York. It's just been, like, emotionally, I don't know, I mean, I had been on like numb for like a minute, right? Just in terms of thinking about just how to process all that crap, it's like every damn day, and I've been like, can't look away from Twitter since August 9th, right? But couldn't really find a whole lot of stuff to say about it. But like actually doing that did something for me emotionally, and it released some things within me that needed to be released. And so I think that what protests do is not always about policy, though that matters, obviously, right? It's not always about policy. It's about being able to feel, right? Being able to do something with those emotions that you experience. I mean, these deaths are, even if I don't know the person, even though I do know people personally who have been impacted by police brutality in really severe ways. But, Mike Brown, I don't know his family, I've never met him, but damn, that hurts, Because I see him and I see my nephews, right? I see, that's a problem. And something has to be done with that emotion. And it's not secondary to policy. It's not unimportant. It's not, this is real stuff, right? And so like the day after the Darren Wilson announcement, I watched that and I was like, whatever. And it was interesting because there were a number of protests. And, this might sound a little weird to some of y'all, but some of you all will understand. There were a bunch of protests in the area. I got onto Twitter and I started, around me. There was a protest in Princeton, there was one in the city, and there was one in Newark, New Jersey. I had to be in Newark. And if you know demographics, you live in New Jersey, I needed to be in Newark. where the demographic is mostly black folks. I couldn't be in Princeton on that day.
No.
It just, no offense. And I was appreciative of the fact that they were out there gathering, and I welcomed the gesture of solidarity, but emotionally, that's not where I needed to be right then. So I think like this question of the individual body, emotional, affective level of what protests do is an important one that we don't talk about often enough when we think about what it is that protests do for people.
Since Avi asked the first question, I just wanted to also invite her to share a recent story, and this touches back to the previous questions about the formation of communities online, but also the surveillance. But I also wanted to invite Avi to talk about a recent incident where the surveillance is coming from other students on this campus.
Okay, so yeah, after the Derek Wilson announcement, a couple of my friends and I decided that we wanted to go out and protest right here on Livingston campus because of not only the history of the campus, but just because we just felt that we had to move and do something that night. It was only a few of us. We went out there chanting, just like infuriated, and we felt like we had the right to be filled with rage and show that rage. And we were harassed by fellow students on campus through various forms of social media, to the point where people even threatened our lives and said like someone should just go out there and like shoot them. So, and call different names. So, for students who are also in the university setting and also everyone else on the panel, how do you respond to that? Because when we're always talking about, collective organizing and things like that and working together, to also see that those faces that are also in the crowd chanting those things, because, there were also people chanting against us, telling us to like leave and go away. Those faces were also other POC people. So, how do you get how do you wrap your mind around the fact that those faces are also you?
I was wondering if I could, I'm not on the panel, but I do teach here at Rutgers. So I just wanted to say, I want to kind of build on what Professor Cooper just said about the fact that this is a public university and you pay tuition to go here. And these things should not happen because you should be being taught the histories and struggles and the moral and ethical imperatives that created, that we are here for as a public university, right? And so you should know that the types of things I'm hearing on this panel, sexual violence, immigration, deportation, police violence, incarceration, surveillance, poverty, genocide, these types of issues are issues that we should be talking about in our classes, in educational spaces, and those are the spaces in which we can build intersections between different racialized communities, between different ethnic communities, between different sexual and gendered communities, religious communities, etc. It's those issues that connect us. Not because we're in the Asian, here, and African Americans are over here. We have issues that we need to work on together. And as educators and as the students who are here paying the tuition to be educated, you need to demand of this institution and of the people around you that you get the types of tools you need to deal with precisely that question. This is not acceptable. Right? And I'm sorry to be on the soapbox because I'm not on the panel, but I teach here, and that is unacceptable.
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 Next time, call me.
Yeah, call us, right? And that's part of changing the culture when we say we want this. That was the project of ethnic studies. That's the project of asking for this type of knowledge, right? So we have, let's take one more question. We should probably wrap up in a minute, but please.
Right, so your comments remind me a lot of Aimé Césaire and a whole bunch of other people, and something that I was thinking about was like the boomerang effect that he talked about, and something that Professor Cooper, you said earlier when you talked about Black Lives Matter, what about all Black Lives Matter? Something that keeps popping up is this move to fight against hashtags or just activism with this colorblind splatter. So all of a sudden, it's all lives matter. Why are you saying Black Lives Matter? How do we work against that in keeping in terms of being intersectional, acknowledging people's many different kinds of identities, acknowledging that while also pointing out Black Lives Matter, all Black Lives Matter, and this is important.
So this actually happened really recently in the Asian American community.
Is this Asian invasion?
Yes, so this past weekend was an amazing weekend because there was the hashtag blackout movement, right? So people, our black folks were posting selfies of themselves, and it was extremely revolutionary, right? Because you are scared for your life every single day just because of the way you look. So to be able to post that publicly, to be proud of it, to love yourself and embrace yourself is truly a revolutionary act. So a lot of other communities, the Asian American community, attempted to co-opt that and tried to create a hashtag called Asian Invasion.
Which in itself is like, it's like, are you trying to be imperialistic or something?
Right,
It's just
exactly.
like, why do you have to take over something that's not ours?
Exactly, and I think we had a short discussion about it where just because we're not posting selfies of ourselves doesn't mean that this movement is something that we should be included in, right? I think I was really frustrated because I've seen this replicated with a lot of white folks where they whine that it's not about us. Who cares? Who cares that it's not about us? This is about elevating voices that are not normally heard and not normally there. It's okay not to push your selfie, right? Go and reblog the other selfies that exist. Amplify those voices because this never happens. It never happens. So it's about holding our community accountable and saying, just because this movement doesn't technically involve you doesn't mean that you can't support it, right? I think that as Asian Americans, we have a lot of thanks to give to all of the black thought leaders and movement leaders because the Asian American movement wouldn't have existed without that. And I think we often forget the history of that, and we need to pay respects to that. We shouldn't be co-opting this movement. We need to elevate and support and liberate black lives because that's liberation for all of us, and I don't think that we have enough discussions around that. Thank you.
Yeah. Just quickly, there was also a brief, like with the Chapel Hill shootings, right? There was a, and I just think it was important to mention where the Chapel Hill shootings recently, right, where 3 young Arab Americans were killed over a parking dispute by their hostile, irate white neighbor. And there was a hashtag that kind of came out immediately, like people started using this Muslim Lives Matter thing. And there was some debate within kind of Muslim circles about the appropriateness of that. I mean, me personally, actually, it was my head is like, I can't even rest, because I'm just like, these intersections, I keep getting run over in the middle of the intersection, because it was, I actually was feeling some kind of way about it. Like, I'm black and I'm Muslim, and I was like, nah, that ain't cool. And it would take too long to really tease out why, but it's just, this question of kind of like, it's just.
I was cool with it though. Like, I gave this talk and I was like, because I was like, look, like Islamophobia and the discourse around terrorism has been deeply problematic. And I'm disappointed often with black communities at the rush to be imperialist that we sometimes have, right? So we also have serious strains of anti-Latino thinking, anti-Asian thinking within black communities. And I thought that it was important to say, and I gave a talk around that time, and I said, look, what links together what happened to those 3 young folks in North Carolina and what happened to Mike Brown and what happened to Trayvon Martin is white folks, be they cops or people who think they're cops, policing the way that folks exist in the space of home. Right? So it's saying you don't get to, like Mike Brown was walking out in the middle of a small street because he lived there, right? Or it was home for him. And so he felt at home. And when you're at home, you kick your leg over the arm of the chair. You don't go to another person's house and do that. But in your home space, you're not going to sit prim and proper on the sofa. Who does that? And if you live in a neighborhood, you might roll out in the middle of the street, because who walks on the sidewalks when you live in a place, right? And the same thing is true for all of these cases, right? That these were people who lived in these places, and because of their racial or ethnic or religious identities or a convergence of these things, were told that they didn't get to be comfortable in home space. And that is connected to all kinds of movements, because white supremacy is fundamentally about the desire to control space. Whether it is about settler colonialism of indigenous lands, a colonization of the lands of people of color, right? Or now overly policing the space in which folks of color of all stripes move and live. And so for me, I wanted us to be able to say, in a world where we exist post 9/11, we do actually need to affirm that Muslim lives matter. Because we do actually think that they're commodities that are more dangerous and more worthy of being policed. And I hear black folks affirming that sometimes. And I'm like, dude, you call them terrorists. We were the original faux terrorists in this country. Don't fall for the okie doke, right? So I didn't see it as co-optation. I saw it as citation. And I don't know how we always.
Yeah, but I think there's part of what I left out there is that from some of those same segments of the community, you still hear folks talking about how Mike Brown was a thug and how, yeah, right. And so it's complicated, which is why I'm sitting in there like, yeah, of course, Islamophobia and anti-black racism, right, peas in a pod. However, right, kind of so it's really interesting. But I think but one of the things I'll say, and I'll just end here, which I think is, even though I think it was an awkward moment in some ways, right, I think the fact that what Professor Chang was talking about, like this ability for social media to kind of bring these communities together and have these kind of simultaneous and overlapping discussions, even if sometimes they become awkward, right, or we make missteps, or we're not really sure, or there's some things that need to be worked out. I think the platform itself, right, enabled these conversations to happen, where I know as an old head, right, now activist trying to bring the issue of anti-black racism within Muslim communities into conversation in my mosques and whatever, pre-social media, it was like, forget it.
Right.
Cats ain't want to hear it, cats ain't want to talk about it, and I'm like, y'all up here, like, we're literally like, the Arabic word abid, which means slave, right, is like commonly used to refer to black folks. So you might hear that, it's like, you got these like really integrated spaces of worship in Muslim communities in America, which is unusual, right? Because churches, and other houses of worship in the U.S. are some of the most segregated spaces we got, right? But then, we all standing together and you just called me the N-word. So it makes those conversations, right, where it's like Muslim lives matter, and I'm a black Muslim, and I'm like, yeah, I don't know how I feel about this, right? But I did appreciate this as like social media being a space where a teachable moment could start to happen, right? I don't know that, I know that the issue is not solved, right? It's not resolved, right? But the fact that it's out there now is enabling conversations in a way that I found like in analog time, in the old age, it was very difficult to get people to have.
I just wanted to maybe tie it all together and say that that's why there has to be an ethics of identity, right? So it's different for a group to appropriate a hashtag, I think, than for you to make an argument that hashtag actually works. I think there's a different sort of thing at work there, right? And it's a difference between an appropriation and an exchange, right? And I think that actually leads out overall to the way that we actually think about identity, period. There's got to be an ethical kind of dimension to all of this at the end of the day. So the same way that you're getting policed, right, by your fellow students, right, fellow students of color, when you're going out there to say what you're saying, that Black Lives Matter, right? That's the same kind of policing, I think, that we can fall danger to as well around these kinds of things that occur if we don't have an ethics of identity. Like, the only reason that we can assert these identities is to liberate folks. And I think that at the end of the day, if we get to a point where we're working from an ethical point of view, and I think this is definitely the Asian American experience for sure, right? Because if we're all about if we're all about just identity at the end of the day, it would be like San Francisco, where the public high school, Loyal High School, right? Public high school, Lowell High School there is now like 80% Asian American because you had Chinese Americans who felt like there should be more Chinese Americans, that an affirmative action was preventing them from being more represented, right? So at the end of the day, you have to say, well, is that ethical? Is that the kind of society that you want to live in? It could be a type of situation where you're arguing your identity pure, right, to the end, right? And at the end of the day, it could just be Asian supremacy, you know, at Lowell High School, right? And so I think that at the end of the day, there has to be that sort of ethical dimension to all of the work that we're doing. And that will allow us to be able to seek out and understand different kinds of struggles that get surfaced in this kind of way. In Twitter time, it happens in a heartbeat, right? It happens in a millisecond, right? And so those are the kinds of battles that we're going to have to kind of face. But I think that if we develop a language around what our ethics are around this, then that'll lead us into a direction where we're actually moving towards racial justice as opposed to moving towards fighting amongst each other more, which is, I think, what everybody wants to see us do. Not everybody, but certainly the status quo is that way. And at the end of the day, it's all about change. Again, it's not Mitch McConnell. It's not a picture of Mitch McConnell. That's not change. All that needs to happen, right, for racial injustice to occur is for nothing to happen. Right? Because the status quo is set up such that racial injustice is the norm. And so if we're pushing towards change, that's what we're looking towards. We're looking to transform things. And all the other side has to do, right? All our work is about creating new images, new ideas, new worlds to present to people and persuade them to move there. All the other side has to do is reappropriate our language.
Yeah.
Right?
And if I could just jump in real quick. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, no, and so I just want to say that at the end of the day, we can't have it twisted. Our work is always going to be hard. We're always going to have to step up in front of these people that are aggressively about maintaining things the way they are, right? So we're always going to have to face that backlash. That's the burden that we carry. And we're always going to have to be on guard, but we always have to continue to innovate. And that's the creativity of the movement, I think, that Martin Luther King was talking about, the creativity, the fire of protest.
So I would like to invite all of you to continue the conversation. There's a lot that were presented today, but I also want to just invite you to give one round of applause for all of our wonderful speakers tonight, please. And one last plug, Professor Chang's books are on sale in the back, and I'm sure he would love to sign copies, so make a trip to the back and then come back up and get it signed by him.